The Singapore police have clarified that there are no legal obstacles preventing Mr. Hsien Yang, the younger son of the late founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, and his wife, Mrs. Suet Fern, from returning to Singapore. This announcement, released on the 11th of October, came in response to media queries following renewed public interest after the death of Mr. Hsien Yang's sister, Dr. Wei Ling, on the 9th of October. In the statement, the police confirmed that there are no legal restraints to Mr. Hsien Yang and Mrs. Suet Fern returning to Singapore. They are, and have always been, free to return. This statement directly addresses the question of whether there are travel restrictions or legal implications surrounding their return. The backdrop to this announcement stems from a police investigation that began in June 2022, when both Mr. Lee and Mrs. Lee were asked to assist in inquiries related to the handling of Lee Kuan Yew's last will. Initially, they had agreed to attend an interview with the police. However, they ultimately did not turn up for the scheduled session and left Singapore on June 15, 2022. Since then, they have not returned to the country. The topic of Mr. Hsien Yang's return has become even more prominent following his decision not to attend his sister's wake and funeral. Instead, arrangements are being managed remotely by Mr. Lee, while his son, Lee Huanwu, oversees them in Singapore, in accordance with Dr. Wei Ling's wishes. Dr. Lee passed away at the age of 69 after a long battle with progressive supranuclear palsy, a rare brain disorder. Her death brought renewed attention to the ongoing tensions within Singapore's first family, particularly around the Lee family's legal battles. Notably, this includes accusations against Mr. Hsien Yang and his wife, Mrs. Suet Fern, related to their role in the handling of Lee Kuan Yew's will. The police reiterated that while Mr. Lee and Mrs. Lee are free to return to Singapore, the ongoing investigations into the couple have not been concluded. This creates an air of uncertainty about what might happen should they return. The police also refrained from providing any assurances regarding whether Mr. Lee and Mrs. Lee could face legal consequences or have their passports impounded upon their return. It is also important to note the ongoing complexity of the legal proceedings surrounding the Lee family. The Straits Times and other local media have reported that in 2020, a disciplinary tribunal found both Mr. Hsien Yang and Mrs. Suet Fern guilty of lying under oath during investigations related to the last will of Lee Kuan Yew. This finding has been central to the case against them. However, what many reports have omitted is a significant legal development involving Mam Kwa Kim Lee, Lee Kuan Yew's former lawyer. In May 2023, a disciplinary tribunal found Mam Kwa guilty of misconduct for misleading the executors of the estate regarding her knowledge of the will. This ruling adds an additional layer of complexity to the case against Mr. Lee and Mrs. Lee, as it directly contradicts previous statements made about the drafting of the will. The police have considerable discretion to continue their investigations for as long as necessary. This open-ended nature adds further uncertainty to the situation, as the investigation could potentially continue indefinitely. Given the high-profile nature of the case and the long-standing tensions within the Lee family, any return by Mr. Hsien Yang and Mrs. Suet Fern to Singapore could potentially reignite legal scrutiny. The Lee family's legal and political challenges have captivated the nation, particularly with the public feud between Mr. Hsien Yang and his elder brother, Prime Minister Hsien Loong, regarding allegations of abuse of power. The situation remains a topic of much discussion in Singapore, with many questioning whether Mr. Hsien Yang will ever return to Singapore, and if so, what legal repercussions he might face. We would like to hear from you. What do you think about the ongoing investigations into Mr. Hsien Yang and his wife, Mrs. Suet Fern? Should they return to Singapore, and what might be the implications if they do? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to 2230 for more detailed coverage on this and other important topics. We always welcome your input and encourage you to engage with us.